The moment Rebecca Williams stepped out of her black sedan, she knew something was wrong. The man standing beside her daughter's school wasn't the security guard she'd been expecting. He was too calm, too focused on the little girl tugging at his sleeve, and when he looked up at Rebecca, there was something in his eyes that made her forget every prepared speech about corporate schedules and professional boundaries. "Mommy, this is Jake," her 6-year-old daughter Emma announced, with the kind of innocent certainty that could either build bridges or burn them down. "He fixed my backpack when the strap broke." Jake Davis straightened slowly, his carpenter's hands still dusty from the morning's work, and Rebecca felt the ground shift beneath her designer heels. In that split second, she had to choose: correct the misunderstanding that was already forming, or let this stranger continue believing she was just another working mother instead of the CEO who could change his life forever. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Lincoln Elementary's pickup zone, and Jake Davis was running exactly 7 minutes behind schedule. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel of his weathered pickup truck as he navigated through the maze of luxury SUVs and pristine sedans that dominated the school's carpool line. 6 years of single parenthood had taught him that 7 minutes might as well be 7 hours in the carefully orchestrated world of elementary school dismissal. His daughter Sophie bounced impatiently beside him, her princess backpack sliding off one shoulder as she pressed her face against the passenger window, scanning the crowd of parents and caregivers with the focused intensity of a child searching for treasure. Her dark hair, so much like her mother's, caught the afternoon light as she twisted in her seat. "There she is, Daddy." Sophie pointed toward a small figure with dark curls who was struggling with a backpack that seemed determined to fall apart. The little girl stood slightly apart from the other children, her face scrunched in concentration as she tried to thread a broken strap through its buckle with the kind of stubborn determination that reminded Jake of himself at that age. Without hesitation, Jake parked his truck and walked over to where the girl stood. Up close, he could see the frustration building in her small features, the way her lower lip trembled slightly as she fought against tears that threatened to spill over. Her school uniform was pristine, except for a small grass stain on one knee, and her shoes were the kind of expensive leather that suggested parents who cared deeply about appearances. "Need some help there?" Jake crouched down to the girl's level, his voice carrying the gentle authority that came naturally after 6 years of coaxing Sophie through her own moments of childhood crisis. The little girl looked up with eyes that were startlingly intelligent, the kind of eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. "It keeps breaking," she said with the kind of frustrated resignation that sounded too old for a 6-year-old, too familiar with disappointment. "Mommy says we'll get a new one, but she's always busy with work stuff. She has meetings and phone calls, and sometimes she forgets." There was no accusation in her voice, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had learned to adapt to the rhythms of adult responsibility. Jake felt something twist in his chest, recognizing the careful way she spoke about her mother's absences, the practiced understanding that came from too many postponed promises. Jake examined the backpack with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years fixing everything from broken toys to leaky faucets, from shattered picture frames to Sophie's countless art projects that fell apart at the worst possible moments. The strap wasn't completely ruined, just pulled through its mounting point where repeated stress had weakened the fabric. He pulled a small multi-tool from his pocket, the metal worn smooth from years of use. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma Williams." "What's yours?" "Jake Davis. My daughter Sophie goes to school here too." He gestured toward Sophie, who had abandoned the truck and was now chatting animatedly with another classmate near the playground equipment, her backpack forgotten on the ground beside her. "Let's see what we can do about this backpack." As Jake worked, Emma watched his hands with fascination, the way he manipulated the small tools with precision and patience. "Are you a doctor for backpacks?" she asked solemnly. Jake chuckled, a sound that seemed to relax something in Emma's posture. Not exactly. I'm a carpenter. I fix houses and build things out of wood, but the same skills work on backpacks too. My daddy used to fix things, Emma said quietly, then caught herself as if she'd revealed too much. Before he went to heaven? The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with the kind of loss that Jake understood all too well. He'd never lost a spouse to death, but he knew the particular weight of single parenthood, the way it colored every interaction with other families. There we go. Jake held up the repaired backpack, testing the strap with gentle tugs to ensure it would hold. Should be good for a while, but you might want to ask your mom to get you a new one soon. This one's getting pretty tired. Emma's face lit up as she shrugged the backpack onto her shoulders, testing the repair with a few experimental bounces that made her curls dance around her face. Thank you, Mr. Jake. You're really good at fixing things. Maybe you could fix other stuff too. It's what I do, Jake said with a smile, standing and brushing the dust from his knees. He glanced around the pickup area, noting the mix of parents, nannies, and the occasional grandparent. Most of the children had already been collected, and he wondered where Emma's mother might be. A working mother, clearly, given Emma's casual mention of meetings and phone calls, probably running late from whatever important business had demanded her attention. As if summoned by his thoughts, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb with the kind of precision that spoke of professional drivers and carefully managed schedules. The car was spotless, expensive without being ostentatious, the kind of vehicle that suggested success without the need to advertise it. Jake watched as a woman stepped out, and he immediately understood where Emma had gotten her intelligent eyes. Rebecca Williams was everything Jake had expected from Emma's brief mentions of her mother's work stuff. Polished, professional, and carrying herself with the kind of confident authority that came from making decisions that affected hundreds of people. Her business suit was perfectly tailored, her dark hair pulled back in a style that managed to be both professional and elegant. But what struck Jake most was the moment of genuine vulnerability that flickered across her face when she spotted Emma talking to a stranger. For just an instant, before the professional mask slipped back into place, Jake saw something raw and unguarded in her expression. Fear, maybe. The particular anxiety of a mother who'd been delayed by circumstances beyond her control, arriving to find her child in an unfamiliar situation. "Mommy!" Emma ran toward the car, her newly repaired backpack bouncing behind her with satisfying reliability. "This is Jake. He fixed my backpack when the strap broke. He's a carpenter, and he has a daughter named Sophie, and he says the same skills work on backpacks and houses." Rebecca's eyes moved from her daughter to Jake, and he saw her taking in his work clothes, his calloused hands, the small tool he was still holding. He waited for the polite but distant thank you that usually came from parents in expensive cars, the subtle signal that their interaction was complete and unnecessary. He'd experienced it before, the careful gratitude that maintained appropriate social distance between the working-class carpenter and the professional parent. Instead, Rebecca extended her hand with a directness that surprised him. "Thank you so much for helping Emma. I'm Rebecca Williams, and I apologize for being late. Traffic was worse than expected." "Jake Davis," he replied, surprised by the firmness of her handshake and the way she actually seemed to see him rather than looking through him. Her hand was soft, but not delicate, manicured, but practical. "No problem at all. Emma's a sweet kid, and it was just a quick fix." "She certainly seems to think you're some kind of superhero," Rebecca said, glancing at her daughter, who was now demonstrating the sturdiness of her repaired backpack to Sophie, who had materialized from wherever she'd been exploring. "Are you picking up a student too?" "My daughter Sophie. She and Emma seem to have become friends." Jake watched as the two girls immediately fell into the kind of easy conversation that adults envied, their age difference of mere months bridging any gap between their different worlds. Rebecca nodded, and Jake noticed her checking her watch with the kind of subtle urgency that suggested a packed schedule waiting somewhere beyond this school pickup line. The gesture was unconscious, professional, the automatic response of someone whose time was measured in billable hours and crucial meetings. He was about to make his excuses, to thank her for her gratitude and retreat to his truck where he belonged, when Emma bounded back over with Sophie in tow. "Mummy, can Jake come to dinner with us? Sophie too? Please?" The request burst out of Emma with the kind of sudden enthusiasm that suggested the idea had been forming while she talked with Sophie. "Sophie says her daddy makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches in the whole world, and I want to know if that's really true." The request hung in the air between them, loaded with the kind of innocent expectation that made adult excuses sound cruel and unnecessary. Jake saw Rebecca's internal calculation, the way she balanced her daughter's happiness against whatever professional obligations were waiting for her, the mental juggling of schedules and responsibilities that every working parent knew by heart. "I don't want to impose," Jake said quickly, recognizing the weight of her hesitation. "I'm sure your mom has important things to do, and we understand how busy work can be." "Actually," Rebecca said, surprising both Jake and herself, "dinner sounds lovely. Do you like Italian food? I know a place that's very family-friendly." 45 minutes later, Jake found himself sitting across from Rebecca Williams at Romano's, a family-owned restaurant that somehow managed to feel both upscale and comfortable. The kind of place that welcomed children without talking down to adults, where the lighting was warm enough for conversation and dim enough for intimacy. Emma and Sophie had claimed a small table nearby, their dinner temporarily forgotten as they worked together on Emma's homework, their heads bent close in the kind of easy friendship that transcended social boundaries. "This is nice," Rebecca said, and Jake heard something in her voice that suggested she meant more than just the restaurant's atmosphere. There was a relaxation in her posture that hadn't been present at the school, as if the formal business armor was slowly being set aside. "I can't remember the last time Emma was this relaxed during dinner. Usually she's rushing through her meal so she can get back to whatever project she's working on. Sophie's the same way. She lights up when she has a friend to talk to." Jake paused, watching as Sophie helped Emma with a math problem, their voices a gentle counterpoint to the restaurant's ambient noise. "It's hard, isn't it? Trying to be everything they need when you're only one person." Rebecca looked up sharply, and Jake worried he'd overstepped some invisible boundary between polite conversation and personal territory. Her wine glass paused halfway to her lips, and for a moment he saw something vulnerable in her expression, the carefully maintained composure wavering slightly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm failing at the most important job I'll ever have," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's gentle hum. "The business stuff comes naturally. Negotiations, strategic planning, managing teams. I've been doing it for years. But this..." She gestured toward Emma with a movement that managed to be both protective and uncertain. "Being a mother, especially doing it alone, I have no idea what I'm doing half the time. Every decision feels like it could be the wrong one." "None of us do," Jake said gently. "I've been at this for 6 years, and I still lie awake some nights wondering if I'm screwing Sophie up somehow. But you're here. You showed up when Emma needed her backpack fixed, even though you were running late from whatever important meeting you left behind. And you're here now, having dinner with your daughter instead of working through the evening like you probably planned. That counts for a lot." Rebecca felt something ease in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for so long that she'd forgotten it was there. When was the last time someone had told her she was enough, just as she was? When had anyone seen past the professional facade to the uncertainty underneath? They fell into an easy conversation that surprised them both with its natural flow. Jake found himself talking about Sophie's love of art and her determination to paint everything in their small apartment, including one memorable incident involving the bathroom wall and a set of watercolors. Rebecca shared stories about Emma's fascination with how things worked and her tendency to take apart toys just to see their internal mechanisms, then leave the pieces scattered across her bedroom floor like the aftermath of a very neat explosion. She gets that from her father, Rebecca said, then quickly looked down at her wine glass, her voice catching slightly. He was an engineer, very methodical about everything. He could take apart a clock and put it back together perfectly, and Emma would sit beside him for hours, watching and asking questions. Jake noticed the past tense but didn't comment directly. Everyone carried their own history, their own losses and disappointments. The careful way Rebecca had mentioned Emma's father suggested wounds that were still healing, grief that was still being processed. Instead, he told her about his work, the satisfaction of building something beautiful and functional with his hands, the way each project taught him something new about problem-solving and patience. How he'd learned carpentry from his grandfather, who'd believed that working with wood was a form of prayer, a way of creating something lasting in a world that seemed increasingly disposable. "What kind of projects do you work on?" Rebecca asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. Her professional instincts recognized someone who was passionate about their craft, who brought the same dedication to their work that she brought to hers. "Right now I'm renovating a Victorian in the Highlands, 1820 Maple Street." Jake's voice carried a note of particular pride as he described the project. "The owners want to preserve the original character while modernizing everything behind the walls. It's challenging work, but I love the puzzle of it. Every day I discover something new about how the house was originally built, some detail that shows the craftsmanship of the people who came before." Rebecca's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. 1820 Maple Street. The address was burned into her memory from months of planning meetings and development proposals. She set her glass down carefully, hoping Jake wouldn't notice the slight tremor in her hand. "That sounds like incredible work," she managed, her voice steady despite the sudden chaos in her thoughts. "It must be satisfying to see something transform like that, to take something beautiful but broken and make it whole again." Their eyes met across the table, and Jake felt something shift between them. Not attraction exactly, though that was certainly present. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that came from meeting someone who truly saw you, who valued the same things you valued even if they expressed them differently. "It is," Jake said softly. "There's something about restoring old things, giving them new life while respecting what they were originally meant to be. It feels important, you know, like I'm preserving something that might otherwise be lost." Rebecca nodded, her throat tight with the weight of what she couldn't say. How could she explain that his beloved project was already lost, that she was the architect of its destruction? How could she tell this man, who spoke about preservation with such reverence, that she was everything he probably despised about modern development? The evening passed too quickly, filled with the kind of conversation that felt both natural and significant. When Emma started yawning over her ice cream, Rebecca checked her watch with visible reluctance. "We should probably head home," she said. "School night and all that." Jake nodded, already missing the easy warmth of the past 2 hours. "Sophie, time to go, sweetheart." As they gathered their things, Emma tugged on Jake's sleeve. "Will I see you again, Mr. Jake?" "I'm sure our paths will cross," Jake said, glancing at Rebecca with a question in his eyes. "Your mom has my number now, in case your backpack needs any more repairs." Outside the restaurant, Rebecca hesitated beside her car. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of traffic. "Thank you for tonight. Emma hasn't been this happy in a long time. And honestly, neither have I. Thank you for inviting us. Sophie had a wonderful time too." They stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to end the evening. The space between them felt charged with possibility, with the beginning of something that neither had expected to find. "Jake," Rebecca called as he was walking toward his truck with Sophie, "would you maybe like to get coffee sometime, when the girls are in school?" Jake smiled, feeling something that had been locked away for years slowly opening. "I'd like that very much." As he drove home, Sophie chattering excitedly about her new friend in the back seat, Jake found himself thinking about the way Rebecca had looked when she laughed at something Emma said. There had been no pretense in that moment, no professional mask, just a mother enjoying time with her daughter. He had no idea that the woman who had shared dinner with him, who had listened to his stories about work and worried about whether she was failing as a mother, was Rebecca Williams of Williams Development Group, the CEO whose company was responsible for the luxury developments he passed every day on his way to work. The woman whose board had approved the demolition of his beloved Victorian just 3 weeks ago. All Jake knew was that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The next morning brought the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Jake glad to be working outdoors. He arrived at the Maple Street Victorian early, wanting to get a good start on the kitchen cabinetry before the afternoon grew too warm. The house was gradually revealing its secrets to him, each day of work uncovering another detail of its original craftsmanship that had been hidden beneath layers of unfortunate renovations from decades past. As he measured for this crown molding, Jake found himself thinking about dinner the night before, about the easy way conversation had flowed between him and Rebecca. There had been something refreshingly genuine about her, a lack of pretense that he hadn't expected from someone who clearly moved in professional circles far removed from his own world of sawdust and construction schedules. His phone buzzed with a text message, pulling him from his thoughts. "Coffee today? There's a place called Grind on 5th Street. Meet at 10? Rebecca." Jake smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. He had just enough time to finish the measurements and clean up before heading across town. Grind was exactly the kind of neighborhood coffee shop that attracted everyone from college students cramming for exams to business executives conducting informal meetings, its mismatched furniture and rotating display of local art creating an atmosphere of comfortable chaos. Jake spotted Rebecca immediately, sitting at a corner table with a laptop open in front of her, her professional demeanor intact, even in jeans and a casual sweater that somehow managed to look both relaxed and expensive. "You made it," she said, closing the laptop as he approached. There was genuine pleasure in her voice, as if his presence was something she'd been looking forward to, rather than simply expecting. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to get away from your project. The beauty of being my own boss," Jake said, settling into the chair across from her. "Though I do have to get back by noon. The homeowners want to see the progress on the kitchen restoration, and I promised them the cabinets would be ready for their inspection." Rebecca nodded, and Jake caught something in her expression that made him think she understood the pressure of client expectations better than most. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, the look of someone who'd spent years managing the delicate balance between creative vision and practical demands. They talked easily over coffee, the conversation flowing from their children to books to the changes happening in the city around them. Rebecca was surprisingly well-informed about urban development issues, speaking knowledgeably about zoning regulations and historical preservation with the kind of insight that suggested more than casual interest. "The development boom has been incredible to watch," Jake said, stirring his second cup of coffee. "Sometimes I wonder if we're losing something important in the process, though. All these beautiful old buildings getting torn down for condos and shopping centers. It feels like we're erasing history for the sake of progress." Rebecca's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her mug. "Progress isn't always pretty," she said carefully, her voice carrying a weight that Jake couldn't quite interpret. "But sometimes change is necessary for a city to grow, to serve the people who live here now, rather than just preserving things for their own sake." "I suppose you're right," Jake said thoughtfully. "I just think there's value in preserving things that have character, you know? Like the house I'm working on now, 1820 Maple Street. It would have been easier and probably cheaper to tear it down and start over, but the owners saw something worth saving, something that connected them to the people who lived there before." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. Every word Jake spoke was a reminder of the decision that had been made in her boardroom, the project that would soon reduce his passionate restoration work to rubble. She wanted to change the subject, to steer the conversation away from the dangerous territory of her professional life, but Jake's enthusiasm was infectious. "What's special about this particular house?" she asked, hating herself for the question, even as the words left her mouth. Jake's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that came from talking about work he truly loved. "It's a Queen Anne Victorian, built in 1895 by a local businessman for his family. The original craftsmanship is incredible. Hand-carved moldings, original hardwood floors, a staircase banister that was carved from a single piece of oak. But what really makes it special is the way it's been loved by the families who've lived there. You can see it in the careful repairs over the years, the way each generation added something while respecting what came before." Rebecca listened to his detailed description, feeling a growing sense of dread as she recognized elements from the architectural survey her company had commissioned. The hand-carved moldings that would be hauled away as debris, the original hardwood floors that would be ripped up to make way for modern foundations, the oak banister that Jake spoke about with such reverence, destined for a dumpster. "The current owners, the Hendersons, have been there for 30 years, Jake continued. "They raised their children in that house, and now they want to restore it so they can pass it down to their grandchildren. There's something beautiful about that kind of continuity, that connection between generations." "It sounds like meaningful work," Rebecca said, her voice barely steady. "The kind of project that must make you feel like you're making a real difference." "It is. Sometimes I think this is the most important work I'll ever do, you know? Preserving something irreplaceable in a world that seems to be losing its sense of history." They talked for another hour, and Jake found himself increasingly drawn to Rebecca's thoughtful way of engaging with ideas, the way she listened with genuine attention rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. When she mentioned having to get back to work for an important meeting, he felt disappointed, but not surprised. "This was really nice," Rebecca said as they walked to their cars. "Maybe we could do it again soon." "I'd like that very much," Jake said. "And maybe next time you could tell me more about this mysterious job of yours. You're very good at changing the subject whenever I ask about your work." Rebecca's smile faltered for just a moment. "It's really not very interesting. Just business stuff, meetings and paperwork and trying to keep everyone happy." Jake nodded, though he noticed she hadn't actually answered his question. Everyone was entitled to their privacy, and he'd learned over the years that some people needed time before they opened up completely about their professional lives. What he didn't know was that Rebecca had spent the entire drive to the coffee shop wrestling with how much truth she could afford to share. That her important meeting was actually a board presentation about the company's next major development project. That the changes they'd discussed over coffee, the progress that sometimes came at the expense of history, were changes she was personally responsible for implementing. She sat in her car for several minutes after Jake drove away, staring at her phone and the dozens of messages that had accumulated during their 2-hour coffee break. Her assistant had sent 3 increasingly urgent reminders about the board meeting, and there were emails from contractors, city planning officials, and investors all requiring immediate attention. But for 2 hours she had been just Rebecca. Not CEO Rebecca Williams with her corner office and her development empire, just a mother who worried about her daughter, a woman who enjoyed intelligent conversation with an interesting man. She couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her and seen something other than her title, her net worth, or her potential usefulness to their own ambitions. The board meeting went well, as Rebecca's meetings generally did. She presented the Maple Street development timeline with her usual combination of thorough preparation and confident authority, answered questions about environmental impact and community benefits with precision, and left the room with unanimous approval for the next phase of construction. It wasn't until she was back in her corner office, reviewing contracts in the quiet efficiency of her executive suite, that she fully absorbed what she'd just approved. The demolition of 1820 Maple Street was scheduled to begin in exactly 6 weeks. The beautiful Victorian that Jake had described with such passion, the house where the Henderson family had built 3 decades of memories, would be reduced to debris to make way for her company's newest luxury development. Rebecca stared at the architectural plans spread across her mahogany desk, seeing them with new eyes. The environmental impact reports that reduced Jake's restoration work to statistical data. The community improvement projections that would displace the Hendersons and their memories. The profit margins that would fund her company's expansion into sustainable housing initiatives. All of it suddenly felt abstract and cold compared to Jake's passionate description of preserving something beautiful, something that connected past and future in ways that quarterly reports could never capture. She reached for her phone 3 times to call Jake, and 3 times put it down again. What could she say? That she had lied about her job? That she was the person responsible for destroying his most important project? That every conversation they'd had about development and progress had been built on a fundamental deception? Instead, she did what she always did when faced with a problem that had no easy solution. She worked. She stayed late reviewing every detail of the Maple Street project, looking for alternatives that might save the Victorian without compromising the development timeline or the community benefits the project would provide. By the time she finally drove home, she had found none that wouldn't cost her company millions and delay affordable housing for dozens of families. Emma was already asleep when Rebecca arrived home to their penthouse apartment, but she stood in her daughter's doorway for a long time, watching the peaceful rise and fall of her breathing. The backpack Jake had repaired sat on Emma's desk, still holding together despite her enthusiastic daily use. It seemed like a metaphor for something, though Rebecca wasn't sure what. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. "Had a great time at coffee. Hope your meeting went well. Looking forward to seeing you and Emma again soon. Sleep tight." Rebecca typed and deleted a dozen responses before finally settling on, "Meeting went fine. Sweet dreams to you and Sophie, too." She lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling of her master bedroom and trying to reconcile the man who had fixed her daughter's backpack with the professional reality that would soon make their friendship impossible. Jake Davis wasn't just some casual acquaintance she could lie to indefinitely. He was becoming important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated, and the deception was growing heavier with each passing day. The next 3 weeks fell into a comfortable routine that neither Jake nor Rebecca had experienced in years. Coffee dates became regular occurrences, squeezed between Jake's work schedule and Rebecca's carefully managed executive calendar. They discovered they both loved classic films from the 1940s, that they shared similar philosophies about raising children without losing themselves in the process, and that conversation between them never seemed to run dry even when they talked for hours. Emma and Sophie's friendship flourished alongside their parents' growing connection. The girls had playdates at Jake's modest but comfortable apartment, where Sophie proudly showed Emma her art supplies, and the wooden dollhouse Jake had built for her 6th birthday, complete with miniature furniture he'd crafted by hand during late nights after Sophie was asleep. Rebecca found herself lingering during pickup times at Jake's apartment, drawn into conversations with him that made her forget about the emails accumulating on her phone and the conference calls she was missing. She watched him interact with both girls with a patience and genuine interest that reminded her of Emma's father, but without the distraction of professional obligations that had always pulled her husband's attention away from family moments. "You're different when you're here," Emma observed one evening as Rebecca tucked her into bed after a playdate that had stretched well into dinner time. "Happier, I think." "Different how, sweetheart?" "Like you're not thinking about work stuff all the time. Like you're just my mom instead of also being that other person who talks on the phone and has meetings." The innocent observation hit Rebecca harder than any boardroom criticism ever had. She realized that Emma was right. When she was with Jake and Sophie, she felt more like herself than she had in years. The constant mental juggling of investor concerns and development timelines faded into background noise when Jake smiled at her across his small kitchen table, or when he helped Sophie with an art project, while Emma cheered them on with the enthusiasm of someone witnessing magic. But the weight of her deception grew heavier each day. She had become skilled at deflecting Jake's questions about her work, changing the subject when he mentioned his progress on the Victorian restoration, and carefully avoiding any mention of her company's development activities around the city. The lies of omission were piling up like financial debt she couldn't pay, and she knew that eventually the bill would come due. Jake, meanwhile, was falling deeper than he'd ever expected to fall again. Rebecca challenged him intellectually in ways that surprised him, engaging with his ideas about craftsmanship and preservation with genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. Her devotion to Emma reminded him of everything he valued most about family, and she had a way of listening that made him feel heard rather than simply acknowledged. The crisis came on a Thursday morning in early November that started like any other. Jake arrived at the Maple Street Victorian to find a cluster of official-looking vehicles parked outside, their presence creating an ominous atmosphere that immediately set his nerves on edge. City inspectors, he assumed at first, though it seemed unusually early for the final inspection he'd been expecting the following week. He was surprised to see Mr. Henderson standing on the front porch with official papers in his hand and an expression Jake had learned to dread over years of dealing with bureaucratic complications. The older man's shoulders were slumped in a way that spoke of defeat, and there was something in his posture that suggested the kind of news that changed everything. "Jake, I'm glad you're here," Mr. Henderson called out, his voice heavy with something that sounded like grief. "We need to talk about the house." Inside the Victorian, surrounded by Jake's careful restoration work, Mr. Henderson explained what the papers contained. A final notice of eminent domain proceedings. The city had exercised its right to claim the property for development purposes, overriding the historical preservation petition they'd been fighting for months, with the kind of bureaucratic finality that brooked no argument. "I don't understand," Jake said, reading through the legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The historical preservation petition was approved by the City Planning Commission. We had the permits, the timeline approval. We had 6 more weeks to complete the restoration. Apparently, the development company made an offer the city couldn't refuse. Something about fast-tracking affordable housing initiatives and increased tax revenue that would benefit the whole community. Mr. Henderson's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd learned that individual dreams rarely survived the machinery of municipal progress. "They're calling it urban renewal, community development. Very noble-sounding language for what amounts to tearing down someone's home." Jake felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach, a dread that had nothing to do with lost income or professional setbacks. "What's the name of the development company?" Mr. Henderson consulted the papers, with the careful attention of someone hoping he'd misread something crucial. "Williams Development Group. You ever heard of them?" The world seemed to tilt sideways, reality shifting in a way that made Jake question everything he thought he knew about the past month of his life. He sat down heavily on the staircase he'd spent 3 weeks restoring, the beautiful wood grain blurring as his mind raced through every conversation he'd had with Rebecca, every careful deflection and change of subject, every moment when he'd thought he was seeing her true self. Williams Development Group. Rebecca Williams. The woman he'd been falling for, the woman who'd shared dinners with him and worried about being a good mother to Emma, was the person responsible for destroying the most important project of his professional life. "Jake, are you all right?" Mr. Henderson was looking at him with concern, clearly worried by the way all color had drained from Jake's face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Jake managed, though he felt anything but fine. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that he couldn't immediately process the full scope of it. "When do we have to be out?" "End of the week. They're moving fast on this one. Mr. Henderson's voice carried decades of disappointment with bureaucratic systems that prioritized efficiency over human impact. I'm sorry, Jake. I know how much this project meant to you. And honestly, the work you've done here is beautiful. It's a damn shame it'll all be torn down to make way for another cookie-cutter development. Jake nodded mechanically, his mind still struggling to process the betrayal. Not just professional betrayal, though that was devastating enough. Personal betrayal of the deepest kind. Every coffee date, every shared laugh, every moment when he'd thought he was connecting with someone who understood his values had been built on lies. Every conversation about preservation and progress. Every time she'd listened to his passionate descriptions of restoring the Victorian, she'd known she was going to destroy it. She'd sat across from him in coffee shops and restaurants, letting him talk about the importance of saving beautiful old things while she planned their demolition. He finished the conversation with Mr. Henderson on autopilot, promising to remove his tools and materials by Friday afternoon. But as soon as the older man left, Jake found himself alone in the house he'd poured his heart into, surrounded by the evidence of craftsmanship that would be reduced to rubble within days. The hand-carved moldings he'd painstakingly restored, the original hardwood floors he'd brought back to their lustrous beauty. The oak banister he'd spent hours cleaning and refinishing, revealing the intricate craftsmanship of artisans who'd been dead for over a century. All of it destined for dumpsters. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Coffee this afternoon? I have something important I want to talk to you about." Jake stared at the message for a long time, his hands shaking with a combination of rage and heartbreak that he'd never experienced before. Something important to talk about. Did she finally plan to tell him the truth, now that it was too late to matter? Was this her idea of damage control? He typed back, "Actually, I think we need to talk too. My place at 7 tonight. Sophie will be at her art class." He spent the rest of the day in a haze of anger and hurt, mechanically packing up tools while his mind replayed every interaction with Rebecca, looking for signs he'd missed, clues he should have recognized. The way she'd grown uncomfortable when he mentioned development projects around the city, her vague answers about her work, the careful way she avoided specifics about her professional responsibilities, the expensive car, the designer clothes he'd noticed but hadn't questioned because he'd been too busy falling in love to think clearly. How could he have been so naive? How could he have believed that someone like Rebecca Williams would be genuinely interested in someone like him unless there was some ulterior motive involved? By 7 o'clock, Jake had worked himself into a state of controlled fury that felt dangerous and unfamiliar. When Rebecca knocked on his apartment door, he opened it with the kind of professional politeness he might have shown to a difficult client who'd tried to cheat him out of payment. "Hi," Rebecca said, and Jake could see immediately that something was very wrong with her usual composed demeanor. Her confidence was replaced by something that looked like dread, and there were shadows under her eyes that suggested she'd slept as poorly as he had. "Thank you for agreeing to meet here." "Come in," Jake said, stepping aside with exaggerated courtesy. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee, maybe? Though I suppose you might prefer something stronger, given what you came here to tell me." Rebecca remained standing near the door, clutching her purse like a lifeline. The casual clothes she wore couldn't disguise the tension in her posture, the way she held herself like someone preparing for an execution. "Jake, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I was—" She stopped, seeming to struggle with words that had never failed her in boardrooms and business negotiations. "Let me guess," Jake said, crossing his arms and leaning against his kitchen counter with deliberate casualness. "You're Rebecca Williams, CEO of Williams Development Group, the company that's about to tear down the Victorian I've been working on for the past 4 months. The color drained from Rebecca's face so completely that Jake thought she might faint. "You know, I found out this morning when Mr. Henderson got his eminent domain notice." Jake's voice was carefully controlled, but Rebecca could hear the fury underneath, barely contained rage that made her take an involuntary step backward. Very efficient work, by the way. Eminent domain for community development and affordable housing initiatives. Noble-sounding language for what amounts to destroying someone's life, work for profit. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, Jake saw something that might have been genuine anguish. Jake, please let me explain. Explain what, exactly? Jake's control was starting to slip, years of careful emotional regulation cracking under the weight of betrayal. Explain how you've been lying to me for weeks, how every conversation we've had about development and progress has been you playing some kind of elaborate game. Or maybe you want to explain how you could sit there listening to me talk about preserving things with character and history, while you knew damn well you were going to bulldoze the most important project I've ever worked on. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. When I first met you at Emma's school, I had no idea you were working on that house. The Maple Street project was approved months before we ever met. By the time I realized the connection, I was already... Already what? Jake's voice was cold, demanding. Already falling in love with you, she said, the words carrying the weight of confession and apology. Jake, I know how this looks. I know what you must think of me. But I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The project was set in motion long before I knew you existed. There was no way for me to anticipate this connection. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter recognition of his own stupidity. So, this is all just a coincidence? Bad luck and unfortunate timing? The project timing, yes, but everything else. Rebecca took a step toward him, her composure finally cracking completely. Everything between us has been real. My feelings for you, the way Emma lights up when she talks about Sophie, the way I feel when I'm with you like I can finally stop pretending to be someone else. None of that was fake or calculated or part of some business strategy. How am I supposed to tell the difference? Jake asked, his voice carrying years of accumulated caution about trusting people who lived in different worlds than his own. How am I supposed to trust anything you say when you've been lying to me since the day we met? When you've let me talk for hours about work you knew you were going to destroy? Rebecca flinched as if he'd struck her, but she didn't back down. I wanted to tell you. So many times I almost said something. But I knew this would happen. I knew you'd look at me differently once you knew what I do for a living, what kind of person I have to be to succeed in my business. You're damn right I look at you differently, Jake said, his anger finally breaking free of his control. I thought you were someone who understood what it meant to build something beautiful, to create something that would last. I thought you cared about more than just profit margins and tax revenue and keeping investors happy. I do care, Rebecca said, her voice stronger now, fueled by the need to make him understand. You think this job is easy for me? You think I don't wrestle with every decision, every project that displaces families or destroys something with historical value? I got into development because I wanted to create affordable housing, to help families find homes they could actually afford in a city that's becoming too expensive for working people. But every choice is a compromise, Jake. Every project means losing something to gain something else. Jake stared at her, seeing for the first time the weight she carried, the impossible balance between idealism and reality that defined her professional life. But his anger was still too fresh, the betrayal too raw for understanding or forgiveness. So the Victorian was just acceptable collateral damage? One beautiful thing sacrificed for the greater good? The Victorian wasn't supposed to have anyone working on it who mattered to me, Rebecca said, tears starting to flow freely now. By the time I realized what was happening, I was in too deep. With the project, with you, with feelings I hadn't expected to have again. I didn't know how to tell you without losing everything that had become important to me. You could have stopped it, Jake said, but his voice carried less conviction now. You're the CEO. You could have found another way, another location. I tried, Rebecca said desperately. I spent weeks looking for alternatives, different sites, modified plans, Anything that might save your project without destroying mine. But the financing is tied to that specific location. The city permits took months to get approved, and there are 40 families on the waiting list for affordable units. If I scrap this project, it delays everything else by at least a year, and those families continue living in substandard housing while we start over. Jake felt some of his anger wavering in the face of her obvious distress, but he couldn't let go of the fundamental betrayal that underlay everything else. You still should have told me. From the beginning. You should have been honest about who you were and what you do. You're right, Rebecca said simply, her honesty cutting through his anger more effectively than any argument could have. I should have. I was a coward, and I hurt you because I was too scared to face the consequences of the truth. I was afraid you'd hate me, afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me right now. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. The apartment felt smaller somehow, filled with the debris of trust that had been built carefully and destroyed completely. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice exhausted rather than angry. I need time to think about this. About us, about whether there's any way forward from here. Rebecca nodded, wiping away tears with the back of her hand in a gesture that made her look younger and more vulnerable. I understand. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but please don't punish Emma for my mistakes. She cares about Sophie so much, and she has so few real friends. This friendship means everything to her. I would never hurt Emma, Jake said, and Rebecca could hear the truth in his voice, the fundamental decency that made his betrayal feel so much worse. But I can't pretend things are the same between us. I can't just pick up where we left off and act like none of this happened. I know. Rebecca moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. For what it's worth, Jake, meeting you changed everything for me. You made me remember why I got into this business in the first place, and you made me want to be better than I thought I could be. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to deserve what we had. After she left, Jake sat alone in his apartment, staring at the wooden dollhouse he'd built for Sophie. Every joint was perfect, every tiny detail carefully crafted with love and patience. It represented everything he valued: permanence, beauty, the satisfaction of creating something that would last longer than the person who made it. In 3 days, bulldozers would reduce months of similar work to rubble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fallen for a woman who represented everything he thought he opposed, and she'd fallen for a man whose work she was systematically destroying. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't hurt so much, if it hadn't left him questioning everything he thought he knew about love and trust and the possibility of building something lasting with another person.